You know, it's one of the biggest debates of our time, right? Science versus God. Are they locked in some kind of eternal war? Well, today we're going to dig into a really powerful argument from Oxford mathematician John Lennox that suggests maybe, just maybe, we've been asking the wrong question this whole time.
All right, so here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to break down John Lennox's case piece by piece. First, we'll tackle that central question. Then we'll get into the, honestly, pretty surprising historical roots of science. After that, we'll look at some of those famous feuds you think you know. Then we'll jump into the modern stuff, the language of life, DNA, and wrap it all up by looking at what Lennox calls an inference to intelligence. Sound good? Let's dive in.
Okay, first things first, let's get right to the core of this whole thing. So that big question, are science and religion in conflict? Well, Lennox kicks things off by basically saying, hold on, that's the wrong question entirely. He argues that framing this as science versus religion totally misses the point and, misidentifies what the real fight is about. See, for him, it's not about the method of science versus a belief system. No, he says the actual clash is between two competing worldviews, theism and atheism. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? I mean, he points out that you've got brilliant Nobel Prize-winning scientists on both sides of this debate, so it can't really be a conflict with science itself, can it? All right, so let's tackle that common argument you always hear. You know the one. Well, of course, the early scientists were religious. Everyone was religious back then. But Lennox says, nope, that's actually missing the point entirely. It's not just a coincidence. He pulls from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead to make a pretty bold claim. He argues that the Judeo-Christian worldview wasn't just some passive background scenery for early science. No, it was actually a key ingredient, a catalyst. The idea is simple but powerful. The belief in a rational, intelligent lawgiver is what gave scientists the confidence to even expect to find rational, understandable laws in nature in the first place. Why would you look for laws if you didn't think a lawgiver put them there? And you don't have to look far for the evidence. I mean, just look at the giants, the very founders of modern science. We're talking about Galileo, Kepler, Isaac Newton. For these guys, belief in God wasn't just some side hobby. Lennox argues it was the absolute engine driving their scientific curiosity and their work. And to back this up even more, he brings up something called the Needham question. It's a fascinating puzzle. Why didn't modern science, the experimental kind, arise in a place like ancient China, which had incredibly advanced technology for its time? Well, the proposed answer is that they were missing a core idea, the concept of a single, rational creator who not only made an orderly universe, but also gave us human minds that were capable of understanding it. That connection was the secret sauce. Okay, but what about those big, famous showdowns, the ones that are always used as proof of the war? Well, Lennox argues that even with these stories, what we think we know, it's not the whole story. Not even close. Let's start with the big one, the Galileo affair. This is Exhibit A, right? It's always presented as the ultimate example of backwards religion persecuting heroic science. It's the poster child for this whole conflict narrative. But when you actually dig into it, Lennox says that story is just, well, it's way too simple. First off, this wasn't science versus faith. Galileo was a devout believer his whole life. The real opposition initially came from other academics, rival philosophers who were totally committed to Aristotle's old ideas, which the church had, kinda unwisely, baked into its own philosophy. The reality was a messy, complicated clash of philosophy, politics, and, as we'll see, some big personalities. And yeah, about those personalities, here's a detail they usually leave out of the textbooks. Galileo had a bit of an ego, and in a masterclass of bad PR, he wrote a book where he put the Pope's arguments, the Pope was actually his friend at the time, into the mouth of a character he named Simplicio, which, you guessed it, basically means simpleton or fool. So yeah, that personal insult had a huge role in escalating things. It wasn't just about the science. All right, on to case study number 2, the legendary Huxley-Wilberforce debate in 1860. The story goes that Thomas Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, stood up for brave new science against the stuffy, dogmatic Bishop Wilberforce. Science versus the church, round 2. But once again, the popular myth kinda hides what was really going on. Lennox points out there was a huge sociological battle happening in the background. Huxley wasn't just defending Darwin. He was trying to carve out a space for a new professional class of scientists and push the old guard, the amateur scientists who were often clergymen, out of the picture. And here's the real shocker. Bishop Wilberforce didn't stand up and thump a Bible.
He explicitly said he would only argue on scientific grounds. The whole thing was way more nuanced than the simple story we're told.
Okay, so that's all history, fascinating as it is. But what about today? What about the biggest challenge of all, the one that's front and center right now, Darwinian evolution and the origin of life?
Now, here's where Lennox makes a really crucial distinction. He says, look, let's be clear about what evolution is actually about. Whatever its powers, evolution is a mechanism that explains the development of life once it's already here. It requires pre-existing, reproducing life to get started. It doesn't and can't explain the origin of life itself. That's a totally different and frankly much harder question. And that brings us right to the heart of modern biology, the DNA molecule. This is where things get really interesting. Because DNA isn't just a complex chemical, it's so much more. It's a code, it's a language, a digital database carrying instructions. And think about it, in all our experience, every time we see a language, a code with specific information, whether it's in a book, on a website, or in computer software, where does it come from? It always comes from a mind. The huge problem for a purely naturalistic view, Lennox argues, is that we know of no natural law that can generate that kind of complex, specified information from scratch. So, where does this all lead? What's the big takeaway from Lennox's perspective? How do we wrap this all up? Now, Lennox is super clear about this. He's not trying to offer some kind of mathematical QED proof for God. That's not what this is. He calls it an inference to the best explanation. And this is not a God of the gaps argument. That's the old idea of saying, well, we don't know how this works, so God must have done it. He's actually flipping that on its head. He's saying, based on the things we do know, like the existence of a complex linguistic code in our cells, an intelligent source is simply the best and most logical explanation. His favorite analogy for this is just beautiful in its simplicity. He says, look, if you're walking on a beach and you see exit written in the sand, what do you think? Do you think, wow, the wind and the waves must have randomly arranged those grains of sand into a meaningful English word? No way. You immediately and correctly assume a mind was behind it. You're not using a mind of the gaps theory. You're just applying what you know about how information works. Just 4 letters is enough. And so that's where Lennox leaves us. He puts a final, powerful question on the table. When we look at a universe that's understandable through the language of mathematics, and when we find that life itself is built on a sophisticated genetic language, is it so unreasonable to think that an intelligent creator is the best explanation for this deeply word-based reality we find ourselves in? The final answer is up to you, but he suggests it's an inference that's absolutely worth considering.